The swamp is silent. Fog rolls over the still, black water-like breath from the gods, muffling every sound but the occasional drip, the subtle croak of something ancient beneath the peat. To the untrained eye, it's a wasteland, damp, cold, lifeless. But to the Vikings, this was the beating heart of their iron. Long before steel clashed on battlefields and sagas spoke of bloodied blades, there was this an untouched bog, hiding nature's most secret treasure beneath its muddy skin. The air is thick, not just with moisture but with memory. Beneath layers of decaying moss and centuries-old sediment lies a substance quietly brewing. Bog iron. It forms slowly, as if the earth herself is forging something in secret. Iron-rich groundwater seeps upward, reacting with oxygen in the wetlands, depositing small nodules, dark, crusted lumps, no larger than a man's fist. This is not ore dug from a mountain with pickaxes and sweat. This is iron born of patience and decay. And to the Norse, it was more than material, it was fate. Every warrior's sword began here, in the stillness. In this murky, forgotten corner of the world, the foundation of a civilization was forming grain by grain, hidden from sight, waiting for the right hands to extract it and breathe it into fire. This is where the legend of Viking-style begins, not in fire, but in the cold, quiet embrace of the swamp. Scandinavia was a land of towering pines, jagged coastlines, and winters that bit straight through bone, yet beneath all its rugged beauty, it held a quiet problem. It had almost no mines, no great mountains filled with rich iron veins, no sprawling mineral fields like those in the Roman world. And yet, somehow, the Vikings forged blades that rivaled anything in Europe, swords that bent but did not break, axes that could shatter shields, spearheads that pierced armor with terrifying precision. How, then, did a people without true ore create weapons that shaped centuries of warfare? This question puzzled historians for generations, prompting theories of stolen iron or imported steel. But the truth is far more fascinating, buried in the landscape itself. The Vikings learned to survive in a world that offered little, and they did so with relentless ingenuity. They looked not to mountains but to wetlands, not to rock but to mud. They discovered that the marshes, those gloomy, waterlogged places everyone else ignored, were generating iron quietly and endlessly. Every season, new deposits formed, replenished by nature's own chemistry. This wasn't a mine you dug once and abandoned. It was a living cycle, renewing itself year after year like a gift from the land. And so the Vikings became masters of taking what the world offered, no matter how small or strange. In a harsh land that starved the unprepared, they learned to read the signs, to trust the earth, to listen to whispers in the soil. Their entire metalworking tradition grew from a single truth. You don't need abundance to build greatness, you need understanding. The absence of ore didn't weaken them. It sharpened their resourcefulness. From scarcity, they forged power. Bog iron was not mined, it was grown. Deep in the wetland's acidic embrace, something extraordinary unfolded over time. As iron-rich groundwater bubbled up from beneath the surface, it collided with the oxygen-rich world above, and a slow alchemy began. Bacteria played their part, two microscopic agents feasting on iron, precipitating it into nodules that clung to roots and pooled in layers just beneath the moss. These nodules, dark and dense like old blood, didn't glitter or gleam. They looked like useless lumps to outsiders, but to the Norse, they were promise incarnate. No one taught them this in books. They learned through generations by watching the land, marking where reeds grew thickest, where moss took on a strange reddish hue. They knew that after the snows melted and the marshes swelled, the new iron would be ready. It was a kind of agricultural metallurgy, harvesting metal as one would harvest grain. The Viking worldview didn't separate man from nature, it saw the two as one, intertwined. And so the process of collecting bog iron became more than labor. It was a communion, kneeling in muck, hands submerged in cold sludge. A Norse farmer might pull forth not just a stone, but the future spine of a blade that would defend his village or accompany him into the afterlife. The land was giving him a gift, forged slowly and silently over years, and he owed it respect. This was metal with a soul born not from violence or conquest, but from patience and the quiet rhythms of the earth. Long before the fires of the forge roared to life, Viking steel began its journey here in a swamp that breathed iron and whispered legend. When the time was right, often in the chill of late spring or early autumn, The iron seekers would rise before dawn, wrapped in wool cloaks still damp from the night mist, and make their way into the heart of the bog. These were not warriors, nor were they ordinary farmers. They were something in between, stewards of a sacred knowledge, passed down like a family heirloom, not in scrolls but in calloused hands and instinctive gestures. Fathers led sons, old men watched the land with eyes that remembered decades of growth, and together they read the language of the swamp. They probed the peat with wooden staffs, felt the give of mud softened by the iron below. A dull thud, a change in resistance, these were the signs. Then, with crude wooden shovels or bare hands, they dug carefully, prying the nodules from their birthplace, knowing that a single misstep could destroy the fragile iron before it ever reached the forge. The work was backbreaking and slow. There was no glamour in it, only silence, sweat, and the suck of earth trying to reclaim what was hers. But for the Vikings, this ritual was vital. It was the first link in the chain that stretched from mud to battlefield. Without these gatherers, there would be no swords, no axes, no defense against raiders or rivals. And so, the bog became a place of both labor and reverence. Fires were never lit here. Voices were kept low. Even the children who sometimes followed with baskets stayed quiet, watching with wide eyes as their elders worked in rhythm with the land. Every handful of ore pulled from the swamp was a future decided, a destiny shaped. The iron seekers did not see themselves as mere collectors. They were harvesters of war, kneeling at the altar of earth and time. Back in the village, the bog iron was not rushed to the forge, it was treated with care, as if it carried something fragile within. Laid out on woven mats or spread across flat stones near the hearth, the nodules were dried slowly under the watchful eyes of smiths and elders. Moisture was the enemy now. It had served its purpose in the swamp, but here it could doom the metal before it ever touched flame. As the iron hardened in the sun, hands worked to clean it, scraping away moss, sediment, and bark-like crusts, until only the dense, dark heart remained. There was rhythm to this work, a pace passed down through generations. No one hurried. The process was too important, too intimate. For the Vikings, iron was never just a material, it was a mystery made solid. And to mishandle it was to offend not just craft, but the old gods who watched from storm and soil. Some would mutter low chants, asking for strength or clarity. Others would press their thumbs into the iron's surface, feeling its weight, sensing its potential. In the background, children imitated their elders, pretending to strike or polish, learning without knowing they were learning. What unfolded here was more than preparation, it was transformation. The bog iron, humble and raw, was being introduced to its destiny. Soon it would enter fire and be tested. But first, it had to be understood. And so, as ravens circled overhead and hearth smoke drifted lazily into the sky, the Vikings practiced their quiet rite, transforming swamp-born stone into something sacred. Long before the anvil rang, long before the warrior gripped the hilt, the forging had already begun. The bloomery was not a towering furnace of brick and bellows, it was a modest, mud-daubed structure, humble in appearance but profound in purpose. Built low to the ground and shaped by hand from a mixture of clay, straw, and ash, it stood like a small altar at the edge of the village, always facing the wind. Its construction was a communal effort. Older men shaped the clay walls with practiced ease, women hauled baskets of charcoal, and younger apprentices placed stone foundations to steady the heat. Even children played their part, fetching water or packing earth, learning through labor. Everything had to be right. The height, the air holes, the thickness of the walls, because the fire to come would test every inch of it. The bloomery was built not just to contain fire, but to breathe with it. Small side vents were angled to draw wind, and the bellows crafted from animal hides and carved wood were fitted to channels that would force air into the heart of the flame. Without this breath, the fire would falter. With it, the swamp-born iron would awaken. Surrounding the furnace, the ground was littered with wood shavings, broken tools, and charcoal dust. It looked chaotic, but it was sacred. This was the threshold between the raw and the refined, between earth and war. As the last stones were set and the furnace dried in the weak sun, the villagers stood back in silent respect. The bloomery was ready. Soon it would roar. Soon, it would melt the bones of the land into a bloom, a mass of molten potential. And in that moment, When mud met fire and iron began to bleed from stone, the Vikings would once again shape the very weapon that shaped them. At twilight, the first spark was struck. Dry peat and birch bark hissed to life beneath a bed of charcoal, and the bloomery began to breathe slow at first, like a beast waking from slumber. The bellows wheezed, then pumped rhythmically as two men worked in tandem, their hands calloused, their backs slick with sweat even in the cold air. The fire glowed orange, then red, then white-hot at its core, fed by alternating layers of bog iron and charcoal. Each addition was deliberate too little iron, and the bloom would be weak, too much, and the fire would choke. Hours passed. The sun fell below the horizon, and the village sank into shadow, but the furnace raged brighter, casting ghostly silhouettes of those tending it. Sparks danced upward like fireflies possessed. The bloomery was alive now, humming, growling, demanding constant care. The ground trembled beneath the forge as the temperature soared above 1,200 degrees Celsius. Inside, the bog iron changed. It didn't melt into liquid like modern steel. It clumped, fused, and slowly transformed into a glowing, spongy mass, the bloom. Around the furnace, the watchers grew quiet. This was the moment of truth. After a full day and night of tending the fire, the furnace was cracked open. Smoke burst out, followed by a roar of heat. With hooked tongs and careful hands, they pulled the bloom still dripping with slag, still radiating heat like a newborn sun from the belly of the earth. It hissed and spat as it met the open air, but it held together. Imperfect, raw, but strong. A lump of iron born from swamp and sweat, now ready to be forged. And as the first hammer struck its surface with a sound like thunder on stone, the long journey from mud to blade began in earnest. The bloom, glowing like a dying star, was hauled onto the anvil, a crude stone slab darkened by generations of use, and the hammering began. Each strike was a clash of worlds, fire meeting muscle, earth meeting will. The bloom hissed and sparked with every blow, slag flying in bursts as the impurities were beaten from its body. This was no simple task. The iron was not yet a blade. It was a stubborn, blistered mass that resisted shape. The smith's arms moved with brutal grace, his rhythm honed by years of repetition and instinct. Fold, hammer, heat, fold again. With every pass through the forge, the metal grew purer, denser. The smith watched for color, not just red or orange, but the subtle shades in between that told him when to strike and when to wait. There were no thermometers, no timers. Only eyes trained by fire and hands that remembered the feel of steel being born. Around him, apprentices fed the fire, turned the metal, brought tools, never speaking unless spoken to. This was sacred space. The blade was beginning to emerge now, its spine thick, its edge rough but proud. Sparks flew like embers from a storm, lighting up the smith's weathered face, lined with soot and focus. The scent of burning charcoal, of scorched iron and sweat, thickened the air. It was exhausting work, physical, relentless, but beneath it was something more. Artistry. The smith wasn't just shaping metal. He was shaping balance, weight, memory. Every curve of the blade, every notch in its tang, was chosen with care. Because one day, this sword would rest in the hands of a man who trusted it with his life. And so, strike by strike, in heat and silence, the swamp-born bloom shed its crude origins and became something more, something lethal, something eternal. Within the glowing forge, something subtle and extraordinary unfolded in alchemy, not of gold, but of resilience. To transform crude iron into true steel, the Vikings understood a secret lost on many of their contemporaries, the dance of carbon. As the heated iron was folded and hammered again and again atop charcoal-fed flames, carbon atoms seeped into its grain like whispers through stone, hardening the metal without shattering its soul. This process, what we now call carburization, was no accident. It was learned through centuries of trial and blood, passed down from master to apprentice not in words, but in touch, in color, in sound. The resulting metal was layered tough, flexible, and strong, able to bend without breaking. Some Viking smiths took it further still, fusing strips of iron with differing carbon contents into intricate patterns, twisting and welding them until the blade bore swirling marks like rivers in steel. These weren't decorations, they were signatures of strength, proof that the blade had been shaped with knowledge and pride. Such blades were rare, costly, and revered, and they held names Ulfberg, Lutfrid, markings etched into the steel, bearing silent witness to the skill behind the forge. Even today, archaeologists unearthing Viking swords marvel at their quality. Some of these blades contain steel so pure, it rivaled that of later industrial ages. But the Vikings didn't need modern factories. They had fire, intuition, and time. Through the deliberate folding and the slow marriage of iron and carbon, they transformed brittle metal into something with memory steel that could hold an edge through storm, through bone, through generations. In each blade lay 1,000 decisions, 1,000 hammer strikes, 1,000 years of accumulated wisdom. This was no mere tool. It was the distilled will of a people who had learned to turn swamp and smoke into strength. When the blade at last took form, its edge refined, its balance tested, its surface cooled from fiery orange to soft gray blue, the sword was still incomplete. For the Vikings, the final act of creation was not metallurgical, but spiritual, the marking. With a chisel in hand and reverence in his heart, the smith would inscribe his identity into the steel, not always with letters, often with runes or symbols, carved deep enough to withstand both war and time. These marks were more than decoration. They were declarations. They spoke of lineage, of craftsmanship, of faith. A spiral might represent Odin's wisdom, a knot, the strength of ancestral blood. Some blades bore the maker's own name, etched proudly across the fuller, a permanent signature in iron. Others bore the names of the blades themselves, for Vikings believed the sword was not just an object but a living force, worthy of a name and bound by fate. A sword might be called Frostbite, Shadowfang, or Worm-tongue, each name chosen not for poetry, but for purpose. The blade was seen as an extension of the man who wielded it, and the one who forged it, and so the mark was a promise, that this sword would not fail, that it carried the soul of its maker. No two blades were alike, just as no two warriors walked the same path. Even the leather-wrapped hilt, the guard forged from scrap iron or antler, the pommel shaped from stone or bone, each detail bore personal meaning. These weren't mass-produced weapons. They were heirlooms, talismans, companions. As the final line was cut into the steel, the smith whispered quietly, perhaps a blessing, perhaps a farewell. Then he stepped back, letting the blade cool in silence. His work was done. The sword now waited to be claimed, not by a customer, but by a destiny. When the warrior finally took the sword into his hands, it was not a moment of transaction, it was a ritual of binding. The weight of the blade was more than iron and lead. It was the heft of lineage, of labor, of legacy. He turned it slowly, letting the edge catch the morning light, studying the pattern-welded ripples along the blade's surface like veins beneath skin. This was not his first weapon, perhaps, but it would be his last. For a Viking, a sword was more than a means of killing. It was a companion, a part of his voice in the world. It rode at his side in the longship. It stood between him and the enemy in foreign lands. It hung beside his bed at night, close to his heartbeat. And when the time came, it would follow him into the earth or onto the pyre, to journey with him into the afterlife. The blade would be named, spoken aloud by his kin, and remembered long after his bones turned to dust. Some swords passed from father to son, their edges sharpened for new wars, but their names never changed. Others were buried with their owners, sealed in graves with silver rings, shields, and stories. But all carried memory. The nicks along the edge, the oil-darkened grip, the slight curve near the tip, each mark was a record, each scratch a chapter. In sagas, warriors swore oaths upon their swords. In raids, they trusted them to cut cleanly through chain and flesh. In duels, they measured their courage by the steadiness of the steel. The bond was sacred, unspoken. No blacksmith could forge such loyalty, but every one of them hoped to give it shape. And so, in that quiet moment when the warrior gripped the hilt and nodded in silence, a new legend began, steel and soul bound by fire, fate, and the swamp that had once whispered its promise beneath the moss. The true test of the blade came not in ceremony, but in the chaos of battle. When the fog rolled in over a foreign shore, when the shield walls locked and war cries shattered the stillness, the sword had to speak clearly without hesitation, without fault. In the hands of its warrior, the Viking blade danced through smoke and blood, cleaving through mail, bone, and shield edge with brutal efficiency. It was not built for elegance, but for survival, for the quick, decisive strikes that ended fights before they began. On the decks of longships, in the narrow alleyways of besieged towns, in the open fields of the north, the blade met its purpose again and again. Some struck down kings, others defended children. All remembered the fire that birthed them. Unlike the heavy broadswords of the Franks or the fine sabers of the East, the Viking sword was a balance of strength and agility, short enough for close combat, long enough to keep death an arm's length away. Its double edge gleamed under cold suns and in the flicker of raid fires, always ready, never resting. And yet, even in the violence, there was honor. A warrior might press the flat of his sword to his forehead before combat, whispering to the gods or to the spirits of his forebears. After the clash, he would clean it with care, oiling the blade, wrapping it once more. This was not superstition, it was respect. For the Viking knew that this sword had survived not just the swamp, the fire, and the forge, but the demands of war. It had stood between life and death and emerged, still whole. And so, as blood cooled on the frozen earth and ravens circled overhead, the blade was lifted high, not in triumph, but in recognition. The swamp had given birth to steel, and now that steel had become survival. As the centuries wore on and Viking warbands gave way to kingdoms, to treaties, to the long hush of history, the swords remained silent, relics tucked beneath burial mounds, lost in riverbeds, buried deep in peat once again. But their legacy had already sunk into the marrow of the earth. The Vikings had forged not just weapons, but a worldview one where nature was not conquered, but partnered with, where scarcity bred brilliance, where the swamp was not a curse, but a forge. In every blade, there echoed the ingenuity of a people who turned bog iron into legend. Their strength lay not only in muscle or ferocity, but in adaptation. Where others sought rich ores and towering furnaces, the Norse looked to the wetlands, those grim, waterlogged places teeming with quiet potential, and saw a future. They read the signs of the land like runes, extracting value where others saw waste. They understood the chemistry of decay and rebirth long before science gave it names. And from it, they built an age of expansion, of exploration, of endurance. Viking steel crossed oceans, shattered fortresses, and carved trade routes through Europe and beyond. Yet at its core was something humbler, a swamp, a flame, a hammer, and a hand that knew what to do. This, perhaps, is the truest inheritance of the Vikings. Not just their thirst for conquest, but their deep intuitive bond with the world beneath their feet. They did not wait for the earth to offer riches, they reached into its mud and made them. And so, long after the last longship was hauled ashore, after the last saga was sung, the blades remained buried but not forgotten. Iron in the blood, iron in the soil, iron in the story. Today, centuries later, the swamps still whisper their secrets, but now, it is archaeologists who listen. In the cold wetlands of Scandinavia, rusted blooms and fragmented blades are unearthed from the same bogs that once birthed them, their forms distorted by time yet unmistakable in origin. What was once sacred work is now sacred discovery. Scientists study the slag layers, the carbon content, the ghostly weld lines within the blades, unraveling the silent genius of Viking metallurgy. Metallurgists marvel at the precision achieved without modern tools, at how these ancient smiths mastered carbon manipulation, heat control, and folding techniques that rival later industrial processes. But the blades tell more than just a technical story. In the residue of charcoal, in the burned clay of collapsed bloomeries, we find the fingerprints of a people who lived hard and thought deeply. In the sword hilts wrapped in rotted leather, we glimpse the hands that once gripped them. In runes etched into steel, we hear the voices of the long-dead calling across time. And sometimes, when the bog offers up a blade still nearly whole, as if preserved on purpose, it feels less like discovery and more like a message one forged in fire, carried by legend, and buried in patience. The past, quite literally, rising from the mud. It reminds us that history is not only written in stone or parchment, but in steel shaped by those who dared to trust their instincts, their earth, and their craft. The swamp iron that once armed raiders, explorers, and kings now sits behind museum glass, but its spirit is no less fierce. It still speaks to those who are willing to listen. The fire has long since cooled. The forge is silent. Yet somewhere in the northern mist, that ancient breath still lingers, the breath that once fed a bloomery, that once whispered to a blade rising red hot from the earth. The Vikings are gone, their longships rotted, their villages reclaimed by moss and time. But their story remains, etched not just in sagas, but in the very steel they left behind. Their swords were not mass-produced artifacts, they were living testaments. Born from the harsh land they revered and the knowledge they never wrote down. Each blade was a miracle of mud and memory, of flame and faith. Forged in backbreaking silence, tempered by elemental force, and carried into the heart of both life and death. Viking swords were never just tools, they were truths, held in hand. And the miracle lies not only in their power, but in their origin. From swamp to furnace, from bloom to battle, the Vikings transformed decay into strength, limitation into legacy. They showed that even in the poorest soil, something eternal can take root if one has the patience to wait, the courage to shape, and the wisdom to wield. The fire that forged those blades has gone out, but its light still glows in the cold steel, resting beneath museum lights, in the soil still waiting to be read, and in the hearts of those who remember that greatness is often born in the most unlikely places. What they built was more than weaponry. It was a philosophy, a fusion of earth, effort, and eternity. And in that union, the Viking sword became not only a legend, but a flame that will never truly die.